right, I'm gonna see if I can do a screen share. So I would like to draw your attention to this draft that I'm working on that basically identifies a framework for thinking about token dynamics. And that this is independent of whether your notion of digital currency is blockchain based or something else, like one of these more centralized architectures that is being proposed in the CDBC. I'm sorry, CBDC proposals. So essentially, I sort of mentioned some of the intuitions last time, but I've taken them to another level of specificity. So the key idea is that there are two interlocking definitions or concepts. One, as I've mentioned, is how much internal structure we find in the token itself. And the other is our definition of economic agency. So initially, I proposed that economic agency is an exchange of messages amongst agents where the things that they're exchanging are non-copyable resources. And that is already sufficient to do something in the road calculus, where we can formalize that idea in the road calculus. So that's why getting these things to sort of relatively crisp definitions allows us to get to a mathematical framework which can help us evaluate their proposals. So before I go on, I just want to check and see if there's any question or considerations about this this idea. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we hear you. I'm looking forward to learning more.
Okay. All right. So no questions yet.
No, not yet.
Okay. All right. So it turns out that as I've mentioned, in physics, if we take matter and energy to be the sort of metaphor or the conceptual, the intuition that supports our notion of token, then the token supply is fixed at the Big Bang and conserved throughout the life cycle of the universe. When we go to chemistry, while chemistry still ascribes to the position that matter and energy is conserved, it articulates more of the structure of matter. So hydrogen has considerably more structure, nuclear structure, than does a quark. And likewise, oxygen has considerably more nuclear structure than does a quark. And so this means that while matter and energy is conserved, you can still get interactions between or within matter and states of matter. And as a result, if we take matter as our metaphor for token at the chemical level, then we get interactions amongst tokens that can change the token supply. So, just in the same way that we might have a supply of hydrogen, we might have a supply of oxygen. If we mix those two supplies together and we throw them in the same wallet, so to speak, then we will get a supply of water and some leftover hydrogen and some leftover oxygen. And it will take some work to retrieve the components, the hydrogen and oxygen, out of water. So in this sense, the token dynamics changes. It becomes richer, even though so the token supply is not quite fixed, even though there's a conservation principle in operation. And by the time we get to biological complexity, so we're looking at entities that are organisms. And organisms have two key aspects. One is they have metabolic structure, and the other is that they have genetic structure. And those two interlocking structures give rise to a wide range of dynamics that have to do that mean that individuals can have morphology and a life cycle and heredity, and there's a notion of selection. Now, how do we relate this to kind of the history of economic agency? So in the paper, I posit a very simple-minded history that's based in a kind of evolutionary perspective, right? So once upon a time, it was easier to bring chits or markers or tokens to the marketplace if you didn't know in advance the volume of trade, and or the goods themselves had some kind of vulnerability. So if you were bringing grain to the marketplace, the grain could spoil just on the way to the marketplace. You could be beset by rain or other inclement conditions. Likewise, going to market with a bag full of tokens or markers is a less obvious target to thieves or brigands than a wagon of grain or a herd of livestock or any of a number of other physical goods. And so there's an energetic and security advantage to using some representation of the resources as opposed to the resources themselves. And the economic agents that discover this trick have an advantage over agents that do not know this trick. And so there's a selective pressure for this kind of representational economic agency. And so the upshot of this, though, is that we view economic agency as representational. So we can think of it as comprised of a syntax and a semantics. And this allows us to refine our previous notion of economic agency. So in reality, economic agency allows us to, sorry about the noise. Economic agency is a set of communicative acts. So economic agents exchange messages, and at some point, the message flow terminates, resulting in a program, which we can think of as a plan or a contract that governs the actual distribution of resources, whether they're goods or services or what have you. The idea is that the program can be rendered in actions by the economic agents, and the ability to render this faithfully is because there's a property of the non-copyability of the resources that are being exchanged. So that's really what's going on. So if you have this, if you get to a sequence of, if a sequence of messages brings you to this point where you have a plan about the distribution of resources, that plan can be made manifest in the physical world if the sequence of messages that got you there and the sequence of messages that are govern the flow of actual resources, they're represented by non-copyable resources. So this is the key. Non-copyability is the key point that distinguishes the digital from the real world. Digital computational things, unless otherwise constrained, are copyable. Now, I do want to say that there's a big caveat there, which is that quantum computational things are not copyable, right? Quantum information is not copyable, and it's not destructible. So no cloning theorems and no deletion theorems are things that are supported by quantum information and quantum computation. So we need to keep that in the back of our minds as we develop this framework. So this is the refinement of economic agency, and we can now take another step and think about a principle. So this principle is that the more structure there is in the resources that can be communicated by the agents, the more agency those things themselves can have. And this is, in some senses, a natural principle, right? It's not a lot of controversy in that. If you think about, again, something like a dollar or any other, a euro or an RMB, anything like that, the only thing we can do with them is count them. Right? There's no internal structure. Like when we think of a physical dollar bill, even though it's replete with all kinds of interesting atomic structuring of the paper and the ink and all kinds of other structures, such as the engraved images and the serial number, we don't really, all of that structure is only to make sure that our counting is successful and that there's no double counting and there's no counterfeiting that messes up the count. That's the only structure we recognize when we talk about currency. It's just the ability to count them and count them under certain kinds of attacks. And the same, so you can imagine how the Fed might be very dismayed if dollar bills could mate and reproduce, right? If they had biological structure, right? But this has all kinds of other consequences. So, for example, there is no way in physical currency to take 5 $1 notes and combine them to get a $1 $5 note. So composition and decomposition of currency must be done exogenously, right? It's done by banks and other financial institutions. It's done by the economic agents that use the currency. rather than done by the currency itself. Now, if you compare that to chemistry, right? So the nuclear structure of sodium and chlorine is what drives the formation of salt. Right? So if you mix some sodium and some chlorine together, you'll get salt. And in fact, even the mixing itself does not have to occur by human agency. Right? Humans can mix them, but they aren't in the process of manufacturing the salt. The salt happens because of the chemical reactions based on the nuclear structure of sodium and chloride. And so that's a difference, right? We're seeing composition and decomposition managed because of the structure of the things, not by some exogenous economic agent. And likewise, at the next level of complexity, a genetic recombination, right? So, take the haploid structure of the genetic material in the cells, right? That where you get half the DNA from the father and half the DNA from the mother. That's happening ubiquitously and without any human agency, right? That happens well below, well outside of what we do, right? So, geese mate without any human intervention. Field mice mate and reproduce without any human intervention. Right? There's no human agency required. And so when we're talking about programmability, and in particular compositional programmability, this principle is very, very important. And in particular, when currency becomes software, then we can have this kind of agency, like the sort of thing that happens when sodium meets chloride, or when hydrogen meets oxygen, or when biological entities reproduce. We can have this kind of entity whilst retaining, or this kind of agency and behavior dynamics, while retaining the original advantages of the virtualization of goods and services. Right? So chits, tokens, markers, these were effectively, it was a kind of information theoretic abstraction of the goods and services to give an energetic and security advantage in the marketplace. When token becomes software, or when currency becomes software, then you can get those same advantages, but you can get other advantages that remove the need for human agency, exogenous agency. And so the example I give is the one I've given before, where you can imagine, at the chemical level, that you have a bunch of rewrite rules, like chemical equations, that take some components and maybe optionally a partially constructed vehicle on the left-hand side, and produce either a complete car or vehicle, or a more completed partially constructed vehicle, right? So if you have a bunch of these rewrite, so for example, you could have a car that has all the interior finished out but no tires, or you could have a car with all the tires fitted but no interior, and so on and so forth. So you can write down a bunch of rewrite rules akin to chemical equations, that when given a stochastic interpretation, could mimic the supply chain dynamics. And now when we think about, in the case of the mobile process calculi, being able to do that at scales, of Avogadro number scales, right? And doing so accurately, it makes sense that that we might want to explore these, because then you get the token supply giving you predictions about inventory management. Right? So manipulating the tokens becomes, is maintained in not necessarily in lockstep, but in close enough alignment with. So maintaining the software and the token supply is in close alignment with the maintenance of the actual inventory. So this is huge, right? This is a gigantic improvement. So let me stop there and see if there are any questions about what I've said.
The way economics developed, like historically, was we had a barter system and we needed an intermediary for a barter system, and then we decided on, okay, let's have gold or silver and so on and so forth, right? So let's use an intermediary instead of a barter system. So
yeah, but the point is, what is the value of the intermediary? And what I've identified is what the value of the intermediary is. The value of the intermediary has to do with virtualization. Right? You don't have to bring your products to market. You only bring some virtual representation of the product. And because you do that, then you are safer and you have spent less energy in conducting the transaction.
right, that's something along the lines of what commodity exchanges do and so on and so forth, right? Is that a reasonable thing to say?
But what I'm talking about is an evolutionary account. Why did this become dominant as a means of coordination? It became dominant as a means of coordination because the Homo sapiens, the economic agents that knew this trick, had significant survival advantage over the Homo sapiens that did not know or deploy this trick.
Right.
Yes. So this articulation of things is different and, in my opinion, superior to the standard economic story, because it places the standard economic story in an evolutionary theory.
And I just want to point out, it's not a question, but more of a comment. I have a better understanding with the explanation. The reference to the energy conservation and the assurance of not creating unwanted copies. I'm sorry, I understand that importance or the significance of that now. So that's a very enlightening example. So that was helpful.
Cool, thanks.
Okay, so I just want to press on in terms of, I'm trying to understand like how, like, I mean, I follow the ideas you're describing in terms of thinking of A plus B becomes C, and A produces n copies of D, and ideas like this, rewrite rules, right? Rewrite rules on tokens, right? And thinking of how people would use it and what people would like how would it interact with our economic systems? Like let's say we have these basic primitives, and like what are the, like how would people use it? Yes.
I just gave you an example. So one way to use it is to recognize that in manufacturing, you have to do inventory management. So if you're manufacturing a car doesn't come, carved out of a block of wood. A car has lots of different components. So in particular, it has a chassis, it has tires, it has an engine, it has an interior, it has electronics. These are all components. So we could imagine that there is a car token, but you only get a car token if you have the right ratio of tire tokens and chassis tokens and interior tokens and electronics tokens. So there's a rewrite rule. In fact, there are several that take partially assembled cars and some components, and takes them to either more complete cars or actually finished cars that can go out to the showroom. Now, this
So
is
this
just one
is
example. Go
okay.
ahead.
Sorry, finish. Yeah. So this is like basically digital representations of like materials, right? This is actually digital representations of materials.
It's digital representation of manufacturing processes, not necessarily materials.
Right, manufacturing process. That's a better. Yeah. Right. Okay.
So that's only one example. You can have many such examples, right? It's just wherever you have componentization, which is basically everywhere. Modularity, modularity is so important, and it's another economic advantage. Herb Simon, for example, gave a great story about this. Right, he imagines two watchmakers, both of whom they call them Tempest and Hora, and both of whom are super popular. Right, they're people call to place orders, on an ever increasing basis. But we imagine that Tempest, whenever Tempest is interrupted, the watch she is working on disassembles into all of its parts. Whereas Hora, it makes watches out of components, and so there can be watches in various partial states of completion. And so a call, the interruption of a call does not result in nearly the same disruption or loss of structure, loss of work, completed work, right? So in this analogy, after a few short generations of the market, engagement with these two watchmakers, Tempest will be out of business, and Hora will completely dominate the market. So this just shows that modularity, componentization of a variety of processes, whether it's the development of software or the development of physical entities, that or biological entities for that matter, that modularity and componentization is a massive evolutionary advantage for the manufacturer, for the economic agent that is constructing items and bringing them to market. And so we will find that these sort of chemical assembly paradigms will be ubiquitous all throughout manufacturing, chemical production, construction. All of these things will be well suited to the sort of chemical level token dynamics. But beyond that, there are lots and lots of processes that involve reproductive entities. So one example is that we've known, again, if you just think about the origins of economic agency, it might very well be that as a part of a dowry, a suitor might receive a portion of a herd. Now, even 2,000 years ago, it was understood that a portion of a herd will grow because beasts reproduce, and unless there are constraints around the deployment of the herd, it could be that the portion of the herd that went to the suitor would compete for the same resources, the same grazing land, the same water, etc., as the original herd. And so typically these kinds of dynamics of these like this are placed into legal documents, other kinds of binding documents outside of the representation of just the head count, right? So you get rights to this land, but not that land, for example, would be added as a part of the overall dowry. But that's kind of a side agreement that goes along with the management of the quote unquote tokens, which are now actual beasts. Wherever we are managing livestock, bacteria supplies, cell strains, etc., which is all throughout the economic sector, we will benefit from token dynamics that has a correspondence that simulates the actual entity that is being virtualized, right? If you can get the token to behave in the manner that the inventory behaves, then you can manage the inventory by managing the token supply.
Sure, that makes sense. Yeah, I can understand where you're going. So yeah, it's a one-to-one representation between, like, at least at some level of abstraction between the material world and the token world, right? So that's along the lines, I think.
Right, but notice where the agency is. The agency has gone out of something like R-Chain Cooperative. R-Chain Cooperative is not managing the token supply. The token dynamics manages, so the rules that govern how tokens interact and how tokens reproduce and so on, that's what's managing the token supply. It's no longer, so the human agency is now one level up. Who writes the rules? Who writes the code? But it's not down at the level of, okay, we need to mint these tokens, right? And we need to ask the community, can we mint these tokens? And so on and so forth. It's at a different layer, a different level. And again, I want to point out something about the disparity of complexity. Think about the total number of denominations, different kinds of bills in US currency. So what's the largest bill? Right? It's $100 bill, right? There's not a denomination above that. Right, so you can go from a penny up to $100 bill. That is your total combinatory capacity, and after that, you have to have stacks of hundreds. Now compare that to the chemical complexity of the nearly endless protein chains that make up an eagle. Right, there's no end in sight in terms of the hierarchical composition capacity of the physical world, right? You can go from chemicals to proteins, from proteins to organisms to populations to superpopulations and planets and so on and so forth. There's no the physical world seems to have no end to the scale at which it can combine and recombine. Whereas to break $100 bill, we can't rely on the structure of the bills, right? We have to go to an institution to get that done. We cannot compose or decompose without going to an external agent. So this means that the structure of currency, while it made sense for the limited virtualization methods available to people at the time, well, in fact, if they had thought about it from an information theoretic or computational perspective, they could have taken things around them in their present moment that were better suited to the task. You could use chemicals to model chemical situations, right? And their representational completeness available in a variety of sort of chemical networks. So you could have used chemicals to represent chemical behavior and to do a kind of coding like that. You could have used bacteria or some kind of petri dish like environment to represent organismal behavior. So all of these things were available to the early pioneering economic agents, but they didn't have a computational perspective. I mean, the computational perspective, as when it begins its articulation in Church and Turing and Gödel, and later Shannon and Scott, right? Those were unique perspectives that came hundreds of years, thousands of years after the beginnings of economic agency. And so we stand at a unique point in history, having seen the development of economic agency and understanding what's going on from an evolutionary perspective, and then saying, well, how can we, when we move to this next revolution in the virtualization of economic agency, right? In other words, using software or software-based currency systems, then we can, then we can look to both information and the natural world in the context of the evolution of economic agency, and get clues about how to design things better. That's essentially what I'm talking about.
So
great stuff, Greg.
So I'm thinking of basically a factory, let's say that takes a refinery, let's say it takes crude oil, it takes energy, and it converts it into a set of distillate. So a representation of a factory in like blockchain, right? It takes like 5 units of energy, 8 units of, let's say, crude oil, and produces 7 units of diesel, 3 units of petrol, or some such thing, right? So is that the kind of like picture you're sort of trying to develop? Like, that's the general direction, right? If I understand correctly.
Yeah, that's a very crude version, but yes, that's one. So again, what I'm trying to do is to develop a framework. Right? The conceptual framework is there's a general principle, which is the less structure a token has, the less inherent structure we can use to exploit, the more any sort of economic agency must be exogenous to the token. It must be imposed outside of the token. And the more structure, the more the economic agency can live inside the token. So this has a consequence for architectures, right? So all of the blockchains, even sophisticated ones like Archie, they're all at the particle level, right? So if we sort of give 3 gradations: particle, no interior structure except the ability to successfully count; chemical, enough internal structure to support rewrite rules; animal, enough interior structure to support abstract notions of metabolism and reproduction. So each of these are different levels of structure inside the token that can give rise to different kinds of token dynamics and different places where the economic agency lives. And so now the point I want to make is that notice that this puts an early decision point. There's a bifurcation in terms of software architecture. If your tokens have no internal structure, then you are forced to introduce a class of agents that will give you this other dynamical behavior, but it's built on top of the particles. Your tokens are particles. So like Ethereum smart contracts are built on top of particles. Right? Ethereum, ETH is a particle. Rev is a particle. So then if you want this other layer of dynamics, you're going to have to posit agents that use the particles, right? Alternatively, you could go another software architectural path. And that software architectural path, for example, is one in which at the very, very bottom, like the tokens are always programs. And I want to argue that the annihilation rule of the row calculus provides a way to make sense of a recursive architecture in which the tokens that govern the security of running Erlang programs are Erlang programs. And that the annihilation rule makes sense of this recursive proposition. So I'll stop there because there's only 10 minutes before dev stand up, and see if there's any questions, comments, feedback. And then next week I'll talk about how the annihilation rule. How the annihilation. Go ahead.
I'm going to add this episode of Casper to my greatest hit selection.
So, I like to mention this sort of little cycle to me. If we look back at the 2013 article from Marius Barglia and Lutz Kaufman on graphical lambda calculus actors, artificial chemicals, connections, topological issues, and knots. I was given credit for finding ways to make this type of connection real. And this is pretty much what we're talking about. And I'll show you quickly a picture of it. This is, I guess, a random example of a chemical setup, which is defined in Chem Lambda. There's the code down here. And then we can, when we run this, we'll get interactions that come down. And basically there's a kind of gravity. And if we increase the gravity, it'll make a tighter thing. We loosen it up, it'll make a bigger thing. And then what we should see is generating other structures that branch off this structure, which we don't seem to be getting right now for some reason. But I can't help but thinking of this as being the sort of the autonomous chemical interaction of the tokens you're describing.
Yep, it's a very good model. Although I would use rho instead of Marius's version of lambda. But yeah, it's the same idea. Right? The idea is that you now have tokens that themselves have behavior. Because they have behavior, you when you're as long as if you can prove an effective by simulation between the token behavior and the real world behavior, then managing the tokens equals managing the real world. And so you get all of the virtualization benefits along with additional parameters of control. And the extent to which this is there's some caveats, right? The energy it takes to do the virtualization, right? So if it takes some significant compute horsepower, for example, that acts as a kind of wall of diminishing returns. Right. So the more complex. Go ahead.
Yeah, just a short point. Like so in principle, like we can actually represent machines which combine like an automated car factory, right? Is also a code, right? Which is built and maintained, but it's still a code. And so yeah, that's so automated car factory, let's say, takes aluminum and lithium and whatnot and produces an electric car. So
Yes.
yeah, there's an analogy between the material world and the physics, and then the computational world. So that's something that, yeah, okay, that's just a comment.
Yeah, exactly. That's precisely what I'm driving at. But I'm trying to set up a framework, a set of principles which allow us to predict the various aspects of different tokenomic designs. And again, I'm not making any moves. I'm not suggesting that our chain adopt a particular policy. I'm trying to get us to think clearly about token design. So, Frank, do you have any thoughts or comments? I'm curious.
Yeah, I thought about so like in the economics, right? So people have like a monetary policies, right? So they think the currency supply should match whatever is needed, right? So the all the goods produced in the society, right? And another one is the Australian economics. So they believe all those rules and policies, right? Eventually they will be used by people, by people who closer to the money, to the mint, machines, right? So eventually, whatever theory design, right? In the end, people want to use their power, use their closeness to the printer machine in order to benefit themselves. So that's why they think the best monetary system is just the gold standard, or it's very similar to Bitcoin, a fixed supply. So there's no way for people to do any kinds of manipulations. So it's not a theory anymore. It's like also you need to take into the people's greediness into consideration. Yeah, just my
No, that's an interesting point. Yeah. So what does self-interest mean in this expanded view? Would be what my takeaway from what you said. So in this expanded view of token dynamics, what is self-interest? And yeah, that makes sense. I can think about that. Cool. Thank you guys very much. I appreciate it. And we will chat again soon.